You don't?
That's the one that matters.
That's the one that matters, that's right.
His hair cutter.
How are you doing?
I'm okay.
Look, we're getting together. Look at us.
I know.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Cool.
Yeah, that's great. People.
Yes.
People.
That's what you need.
Because I mean, also my glasses are.
But I just felt like, yeah, I wasn't able to go and sit down and catch it.
Oh, I'm not reading this.
You are?
Every time I see them, I have to look at it. I keep remembering Brewster's version with one of the seeds being turned into a scan.
Sure, let's do it.
All right, are you coming out next?
Well, I still remember. I really can't tell.
It's like he lives in the back. It's like he lives in a hotel.
Good evening, everyone.
Not on.
I'm not on.
No, you'll need to be loud.
Good evening. I think we're going to get started now. All the way on. Who looks funny? Thank you. All right. I'm Sharon G., President of the Board of the Book Club of California. And on behalf of our book club, I'm delighted to welcome members and guests. Those of you who are here in person with us, and those of you who are streaming us on YouTube. Welcome. For those of you who are new to us, the book club is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization founded in 1912. Our mission is to preserve and promote the history of the book and the book arts, and we have a particular interest in the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, hosts a year-round series of exhibitions and programs, both here and in Southern California when we're meeting in person, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and more. The Book Club of California's community is made up of collectors, printers, designers, booksellers, publishers, writers, and book lovers of all stripes. Membership in the club is open to all. And if any of you are interested in joining, please speak with me or a member of our staff or a member of the board if you're here in-house, or check out our website at www.bccbooks.org. Now to tonight's program. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the book club and tonight's program, which is the 2021 Oscar Lewis Awards. The Oscar Lewis Awards were established by the Book Club of California in 1994 in honor of Oscar Lewis, the San Francisco author, historian, and Book Club of California secretary from 1921 to 1946. The Oscar Lewis Awards recognizes outstanding contributions in two fields, Western history and the book arts. Past awardees include some of the most accomplished printers, designers, book artists, and historians. And tonight's honorees are equally talented and impressive. Because the pandemic prohibited us from gathering in person last year, we will actually recognize the 2020 honorees alongside our 2021 recipients. First, I'd like to thank Richard Siebert and Matt Kelsey for designing and printing the elegant letterpress invitations and certificates that we will be presenting to our honorees. For those of you who are here, on display in the vitrines in the back of the room are a selection of invitations and certificates that we hold in the Spirison Library's collection of ephemera. Finally, I would like to thank Norman Clayton and Robert Kittle, co-chairs of the Oscar Lewis Awards Committee, and the other committee members who served in 2020 and 2021. So first, we will recognize the 2020 Oscar Lewis Award recipients for the Western history and the book arts. I'd like to ask board member Norman Clayton, co-chair of the Oscar Lewis Awards, to present the book arts award.
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everyone. My name is Norman Clayton, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm jumping up and down, thrilled to be here this evening because I have so much love in my heart and joy for the recipients of the Oscar Lewis Award, both for this year and last year. First, as Sharon mentioned, we'll recognize the 2020 honorees for the achievements in the book arts. In 1996, Mary Austin and Kathleen Burch co-founded the San Francisco Center for the Book. Its letterpress and bookbinding studios, workshops, exhibitions, and events serve thousands of delighted students every year. Mary Austin, an Ohio native, graduated from Wesley College in 1982 and helped start the Museum of Printing History in Houston, Texas, and the San Francisco Museum Explore Print, which she also directed. Mary has been an advocate of fine printing and the book arts for over 35 years. She's an artist, book collector, philanthropist, and proprietor of the Underground Press. And Kathleen Burch, a native of Vallejo, California, graduated from Mills College in 1973 and founded Burch Typographica, a San Francisco type and design studio, in 1979. A past president of the Book Club of California, she serves on the board of the Internet Archive and was a Xerox PARC artist in residence. She is active in the keepsake culture of California and designed the BCC's Centennial programs of 2012 and the MFK Fisher keepsake of 2008, both major book club keepsakes. These two women have built a community of book arts training and appreciation that is truly unequaled. Countless people in the Bay Area and beyond are endlessly grateful to them for what they have so generously created. I'm so happy to be the person who is introducing the recipients for the 2020 Oscar Lewis Award in Book Arts because of my sincere personal appreciation of these two women in the upbringing of me as a book artist and letterpress printer. I remember when I first began teaching at the San Francisco Center for the Book, I taught photopolymer plate making, and I love to tell the story that the plate making room shared space with the broom closet. Do you remember that space? So today's wonderful, wonderful accommodations are fabulous and larger, but back then it was those were the first steps, wonderful, wonderful first steps. So I feel tonight like a conduit a bit for so many people who love you both and have so much gratitude in their hearts and in my heart for what you've done for the book arts community and the letterpress community and the world, as far as I'm concerned.
Hear, hear.
So please join me in congratulating Mary Austin and Kathleen Burch, recipients of the 2020 Oscar Lewis Award for the Book Arts. Mary and Kathleen contributed a wonderful abecedarium titled ABC for BCC that appeared in the fall 2020 quarterly, and you all will be able to take copies of that issue tonight with you if you want an extra copy or don't have one. So I'd like to invite Mary and Kathleen to the podium for their delightful and joyful remarks this evening.
Thank you, Norm. Allow us to elaborate an adorned acceptance allocution abecedarium.
Shall we begin our banter back and forth?
Agreed. A is for the amazing Austin Burch Gallery.
Astonishing!
And archive it.
I adore alliterations.
B is for the bibliophilic bookies beginning beneath a brilliantly beautiful blue moon.
Book buffs
One in particular.
and best-selling burning books.
C is for Caslon, both child and character.
Iconic, don't you think?
And time for that type cheer.
No, you'll see us do that later. D is for domestic science.
And the dynamic interpretive dance which delighted the directors of the Grants for the Arts.
Darn, dang, if it didn't deliver us donations.
Dare we demo, dear?
That's the interpretive dance.
E,
Is for envisioning expanse with
experimental and environmentally friendly additions, and
exquisite exhibitions and
enthusiasm everywhere, ever flowing, evermore. F is for our phenomenal future, which starts without foundering first steps.
and finally a font named after my second child.
Maybe. G.
G is for gracious godmothers to whom we grant great gratitude.
They galvanize and gladden us ongoingly.
H is for the Hayakumani Durrani scroll, which herein heralds printing heritage.
And happily. Helvetica. Some love it, some love to hate it. But as for me, I dote upon it. I is for inspiration.
Introductions.
Indicia of romance.
Ooh, intensely inviting.
J.
J is for Johannes, no yoke, Gutenberg.
K.
Is for the Cathys, from the two of us to St. Catherine, patron saint of libraries.
And knowledge and occasional concepts. L is for logos.
From lozenge to lateral books to a lexicon of literary letters et al.
Lovely. And
M is for movable walls, which made us moldable and malleable.
multiples. Marvelously magic.
Ah, now note this.
N is for Naked in the News, for a novella of note.
O is for the outstanding odd utterances.
Onward!
And 2 Oxbow residencies for the duo of us.
Outrageous. P.
P is for palm leaf books plus
Poets polling prints. Predictively, poets partnered with printers.
peachy. And of course, punctuation party, providing a pretext for a plethora of pleasure.
Presses and Places Co-op.
And the power of print.
Q Q is for P's and Q's.
And for Q as in queen. Quintessential, don't you think?
Absolutely. R is for roadworks.
Riveting, rocking and rolling, printing of room-scale prints right in front of our residence on 375 Rhode Island.
Remarkable. And
S is for, you guessed it, San Francisco Center for the Book.
small plays.
Oh yeah, and steamroller,
Startlingly
spectacularly.
superlative.
T is for team and typography.
'Tis a terrific time to be into type.
Oh, and now for that typesetter's cheer we promised. Flush 'em to the left, flush 'em to the right, eliminate rivers and curl them tight.
U.
U is for the underground press and unlimited editions,
Unbelievable. Maybe even unconventional.
but undoubtedly upbeat.
V is for Vandercook or Vandy.
As we like to verbalize as visionary, vivacious vixens.
W is for our wonderful world-class workshop wizards.
Without our workshop teachers, we would wax, well, woefully.
And the Y Cheap Art Manifesto.
Art is food. You can't eat it, but it feeds you. Art soothes pain. Art wakes up sleepers. Hurrah!
X is for Ex Libris. Need we expound more?
Y is for, you call that a book? And the yes cards.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. And Z is for Zopfest, celebrating the zany and zealous Zopfs.
Almost before the bell, our center-centric distillation ends. For our finale,
Thank you.
or should we say obrigado?
Don't.
Oh yeah, or come on.
Come on. Danke.
Grazie.
Merci.
Obrigado.
Ici.
Chopin. Very classy.
Please come accept these certificates for Mary and Kathleen.
Thank you.
And we have an added treat tonight from your delightful friend and ours, Allison Kuhn. She has a special certificate for you as well. She calls it an Alpha Fanfare in tribute to Mary and Kathleen's albicentenary. Let's read it. Because here it is. Let's read it out loud all together. And give me a break then.
Envisioners, finessers, generators. Kathleen and Mary,
Vive les workshops, exhibitions, and
Congratulations again, Mary and Kathleen. And now please welcome back to the podium Sharon, who will announce the 2020 awardee for history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norman. I would also like to extend my congratulations to Mary and Kathleen. I love you as well. I've taken classes at San Francisco Center of the Book, which I have absolutely loved. And you both really, deserve this honor, and I don't understand why you didn't have it before. So, congratulations. The 2020 Oscar Lewis Award for Western History was awarded to John Briscoe. John Briscoe is a poet, author, restaurateur, San Francisco lawyer, and board member of the Historical Society of the United States District Court in San Francisco. His historical publications include 2 books, Tadich Grill, the story of San Francisco's oldest restaurant, and Crush, the triumph of California wine. He has also written and published scholarly essays on historical California figures such as Garrett W. McInerney, Stefan A. Riesenfield, and Louis F. Claiborne, and he contributed to the definitive history of the San Francisco District Court, the oldest federal court in the West. Briscoe is a distinguished fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, which will publish his oral history this fall. Crush is the vividly told story of how California wine gained global recognition. Briscoe recounts wine's usual relationship with California from the very first vintage through multiple calamities to its starting triumph at a blind tasting in Paris in 1976. Through this innovative perspective, Briscoe profiles the larger story of California. He has, through verve and distinctive flair for writing, made California's past accessible to a broad audience. Crush has won numerous awards and is destined to become a classic, not only of wine literature, but also of California history, people, and culture. John contributed a terrific essay ending with, "Tell the next mayor or supervisor or nihilist you see that history is fun." It appeared in the fall 2020 quarterly, but I'd like to invite John to the podium to give brief remarks this evening.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And it's customary and almost hackneyed to say, well, somebody standing here in this position, I'm humbled, but I really am to be in the company of people like Brewster Kahle, Kevin Starr, Jim Holliday, Carl Nolte, and on and on and on. And this evening, my dear departed friend Charles Fracchia. I do have to note that some of the really over-the-top language that Sharon read to you about destined to become a classic in the literature of California and the history of wine, I did not write. Kevin Starr did, and I'm eternally indebted, not only for those words, but for his encouragement that I write what I did. That 28 years ago, I was spending a couple of weeks at the home of a friend of mine in a little village, Wivenhoe, England. Does anybody know Wivenhoe? About 45 miles east of London. The only people who live there are writers, artists, sculptors, John Doubleday, Lila Berg, on and on and on, Hugh Brogan. And my friend Claiborne lived there. And his first language had been French. He was my closest friend and he was my law partner. And the house was 4 stories, 12 Park Row, Wivenhoe. And it was all these rooms. Mrs. Claiborne had a restaurant that got a Michelin star, so there was a world-class kitchen. She was an artist, and there were rooms full of her paintings. And he loved to read in all manner of languages. There was a whole room of French. So one evening, I took my brandy and I just settled in the French room. And here's this, it looked like the Oxford English Dictionary, not the condensed version, however many volumes it is. And I looked at it as Le Grand Dictionnaire de Cuisine by a man named, my high school French is terrible, and the bad boy in me wants to say Alexander Dumas, but it was Alexandre Dumas. And I thought, what is this? And it was an encyclopedia of cuisine. And the most extraordinary work I had ever seen. I started thumbing through one of the volumes, and again, my high school French at work, I come upon the sentence, after Paris, the greatest restaurant city in the world is San Francisco. And I thought, well, when was this published? 1873. Now later I worked out, it had to have been finished no later than 1869 because it was Dumas. This is the only thing he actually wrote. He did not write those 260 novels like the Count of Monte Cristo. He had ghostwriters do that. This was his passion. This was the real thing that he wrote. And he wrote this extraordinary sentence. You ever have one of those moments where something happens and you go, it's like when you fall in love, as I did with Carol, when you go, uh-oh, my life has changed forever, because he couldn't have written that later than 1869, which is only 20 years after San Francisco became a real city. San Francisco was nothing until 1849. Population fewer than 500 people. By the end of that year, maybe 25,000, maybe 50,000, nobody knows. And I knew my life had changed. I had to answer the question, how did that happen? How did a Parisian, the greatest culinary scholar to date, maybe since, this was his life's work, published posthumously 3 years after his death. How could he say that about a place way out there? No transcontinental railroad, no Panama Canal. Never been to San Francisco. He never was. He did have a fling with a lady who spent a lot of time there, Lily Langtry, and I suspect that he learned a lot about San Francisco from her. But I'm hooked, right? It's like falling in love. I gotta write the story, so I wrote that story. In the middle of it, I thought, well, you can't talk about San Francisco food without talking about California wine. And then I realized, well, California wine did not get recognized early on. As a matter of fact, while people recognized the potential for California wine very early, in the early 1800s, a Frenchman named Jean-Louis Vigna, Jean-Louis Vigna, which means vines or vineyard, he wrote long letters to his friends back in Bordeaux saying this country, and he founded a winery in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the founding of commercial winemaking in California, not up here. But really, we didn't arrive, California wine didn't arrive on the world stage until 1976, that, famous blind tasting in Paris on a slow news day, thank heavens, because we wouldn't have known about it. Had the Time magazine correspondent in Paris had anything else to do that day, we'd never have known about the wine tasting, because all the French judges were furious that they had voted for California wines in that. So the first grapes were planted here in 1771, and it takes more than 200 years for California wines to be recognized as among the world's greatest. So that's the opposite question. What took so long with food is, how the heck did that happen so fast in a little place called San Francisco? And so I got, again, smitten, and I had to figure out the answer, and that's how I spent a lot of hours writing Crush. And it was delightful. So many people encouraged me along the way. Charles Fracchia, for one. Warren Hinkle beat me up. You gotta write that book too, and you got 3 or 4 others in yet. And Kevin Starr and Carol. And Carol read the manuscript over and over and came up with the title Crush. And it took me about 3 days to realize that's not a double entendre, that's a quadruple entendre. And thank you, dear, for that. And thank you, the Book Club of California, for what you do, what you represent. And as I wrote in my essay, we're the lucky ones. We know somehow, somebody taught us that history is fun, I sure had a lot of history teachers that didn't do that. They made it dreadful, they made it awful. But I had 1 or 2 And truth be told, it took getting away from college and then, oh yeah, don't I remember that from European history or whatever? And then the curiosity really takes hold. And what the club does is to preserve not only that passion for history, trying to pass it on to future generations, but also the passion for the beautifully produced book. And you know what? Those are going to become more and more important. I write in my essay about the impulse of, one might say, barbarians or conquerors to destroy knowledge. And I give a number of examples. Not too well known is in 221 BC, the first emperor of China. Think the completion of the Great Wall. This is after 3,000 years of Chinese civilization already. The completion of the Great Wall, the terracotta warriors, the building of a mausoleum that will probably soon be exhumed, and we will be blown away because nobody believed the stories about the thousands of terracotta warriors until they were found in 1974. And this first emperor ordered the burning of all books in China. Okay? And the people rose up in anger, and he wanted to hoard all knowledge, and he had libraries and scholars. The masses rose up and they burned the emperor's libraries. Now this is 300 years after Confucius. We are very lucky that we have Confucius's 5 books, but think how much we don't have. Think about the fact that Aeschylus and Sophocles each wrote approximately 100 plays. We have 7, and we know why we don't have the others. What great wisdom, what, we enjoy taking in those 7 plays of each. What have we lost? And what if, I hate to say this, Brewster, I know, I've done work in this field, that there are monster terrorists out there that know the best way to get their bidding is to not to drop a nuclear device on New York City or whatever, but to figure out a way to erase all digital knowledge in the world. They're at work at it. So let's keep producing the books. Thank you very much.
Don't go away, John.
Thanks. I'm sorry it wasn't Abecedarianism.
I want to present you with your certificate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, folks.
All right, congratulations again, and to present the 2021 Oscar Lewis Award for the Book Arts, once again, Norman Clayton.
I'm delighted also, again, to tell you about this year's recipient of the Oscar Lewis Awards for the Book Arts. Wesley Tanner is also a very important person in my history as a fine printer. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about his history and a synopsis, and then we get to see a video that he recorded for this evening that we will broadcast. Wesley B. Tanner is a fine printer, artist, and book designer in the long and distinguished line of autodidactic scholar printers found in California, such as his mentors, John C. Tarr and Roger Levinson. Going on to mentor others, including Alistair Johnston and Jerry Redden, he partnered with Will Powers to print fine print as well as the Book Club of California's own quarterly newsletter. I did not know this, but printing has been a family tradition for Wesley since G.A. Tanner and his 2 brothers opened a shop and newspaper in 1870s Toledo. Wesley Tanner has been a letterpress printer since wandering into a printing class in junior high school in 1960. 3 years later, the year I was born, he entered the trade at 16 years old after landing a job at Press Baza, one of the early California beat poetry presses. Coming to the San Francisco Bay Area from his native Los Angeles to study letterpress printing at Laney College, he found tutelage in the rare book room at UC Berkeley from Mrs. Leslie S. Clark, and then from a long friendship with James D. Hart and the staff at the Bancroft Library. With cohorts among the Bay Area writers and poets of his time, such as Joanne Krieger and Michael McClure, he maintained a printing office on 9th Street in West Berkeley, where he produced work of extraordinary quality. At the Arif Press, founded in 1971, Wesley Tanner has published numerous books of poetry and fine art. His work has been extensively shown and collected in libraries and has won numerous awards. In 2013 and 2017, 2 of his book designs were featured in the American Institute of Graphic Arts 50 Books, 50 Covers shows. And I'll add to that, while others were protesting and partying in the streets, Wesley was printing beautiful books in his studio in Berkeley. Wesley has maintained his ties to California even when residing in the Midwest and now the East. He has been an active member of the Book Club of California as a printer member and as a printer member of the Roxburgh Club of San Francisco. The reason Wesley is important to me in my history as a fine printer is that I first met him when he was selling his equipment from 9th Street and moving to Michigan in the summer of 1990. That was the time that Michael Osborne and I were out looking around to buy a letterpress shop, and we were extraordinarily fortunate that Wesley was looking at the same time to sell his entire shop, which Michael bought, and I ran that press, those presses that Wesley left behind for years and years, and that's where I cut my teeth and figured out what to do right and wrong in terms of printing. So I'll share one brief memory that I have of Wesley, and then we get to see him speak for himself. I did not get to learn much from Wesley, but what I did will always be with me, because just before he was packing up his foundry type and his proof press and to leave everything else behind for me to figure out how to use, he was finishing the printing of the quarterly newsletter for the book club. So I have a very distinct memory, which will always be with me, of Wesley holding up this press sheet with his very discerning eye and being able to judge the color of the ink on those 4 pages on that one press sheet. And I could see, what little I could see the mastery that he had attained, that I was looking to attain, of being able to tell when that press sheet is perfectly even from one corner to the next, so that when it's folded and collated and bound, the color of the page is exactly the same from page 1 to page 100 or whatever. And that is a skill, that is a talent that is not automated, and was not automated for him, and is still not automated in the letterpress shop. But I admired that in Wesley, and looked forward to the days hopefully that I hoped that I would also be able to print the quarterly newsletter for the book club. Okay, so now please join me in congratulating Wesley Tanner, recipient of the 2021 Oscar Lewis Award for Book Arts. Wesley couldn't be with us tonight, as you can tell, because he's not here, but he did record these remarks, which we will now enjoy watching. Thank you.
Good evening, members of the Book Club of California and friends. I would like to begin by thanking the Oscar Lewis Committee for this award and for the opportunity to make some remarks from my home here in Western Massachusetts. I operated my printing press in Berkeley for about 20 years in what was then a largely abandoned industrial zone. Well, we all know what happened there. After I relocated to Ann Arbor, Michigan, I continued to print books and to expand my design practice to books of scholarly material and art books. And I produced hundreds of titles for publishers during those years. The University of Michigan School of Art and Design hired me to teach upper-level graphic design courses, and I'm pleased to say that a few of my students have gone on to be book designers as well. 2 years ago, my wife Jamie and I found a beautiful home with a large studio in Great Barrington, where we now live. But I'm sure many of you would like to know about my time in the Bay Area as a member of the book arts community during the 1970s and 80s. It was about in 1954 when my father brought home a mimeograph machine to print a newsletter for his local group. And we had a good deal of fun in the kitchen, lots of messy stencils and things, and that was my introduction to printing. Although his great uncles had been printers in Ohio and in Michigan, where they printed newspapers. My grandfather worked for them, and my father, of course, had that knowledge. So it was no surprise to him to find a mimeograph in his kitchen, though it was for me. But it wasn't until later, in 1960, that I got my hands on an actual piece of type. On my first day of junior high school, I was told to choose a shop class. So I headed straight off to the print shop. Why not? That wintry day in California, in Los Angeles, was rather on the dark side, and what I remember clearly was a large World War II poster high up on the wall that said, "Slip of the lip will sink a ship." Well, soon after some general instructions, our instructor, Norman Rose, which included some warnings about not to wear a necktie while running a press, we were busy at work. This is the first time I have set type. We'll work very slowly and carefully and not make any mistakes. Reads the yellowing slip of newsprint I still treasure. It's set in 10-point century school book. I'm not sure what else we did in those early years. I continued to take print shop throughout my high school years, and when I became 16, I landed my first job as a printer in a local job shop, Alexander's Printing Service. I stood on a little box and ran a Chandler and Price Platinum press for 2 hours every afternoon, printing envelopes for the Shriners Convention. Bob Alexander was one of the Beat Generation printers, and often other members of that era would come by, like Wallace Berman. The next summer, through the help of my father's friend, I worked afternoons printing an offset press and cutting paper. I'm sure my employers at the Hollywood print shop would have been quite shocked to learn that my friend's father wasn't just their ink salesman. He was the national treasurer of the Communist Party. Though, of course, that was all very secret then. After graduating from high school, I moved to the Bay Area to enroll in the printing course then being taught at Laney College in Oakland. But I soon tired of lessons, went out to work in the trade. Berkeley in 1965 was, of course, a very exciting place to live, and I made friends with some of the local poets. Looking at the poetry in the local bookshops, I found that some of the nicest books to read had been printed locally. Wanting to see more of the work of certain authors, I found my way up to the University of California campus, and there in the rare book room, I made two very important discoveries. The first was the observation that many of the books I admired were printed by a process I was quite familiar with, letterpress printing. And the second was Leslie Clark, the librarian. She took the time to show me books that fired my imagination, not just the literature books, but the extraordinary collection on the history of printing. Leslie took me under her wing and let me have the run of the place. Years later, the rare book room merged with the Bancroft Library and all the books, and Leslie went there. In those early days, there was 3 small, beautiful rooms with long oak tables, and I could just go in and pull books off the shelf. It was a very nourishing environment. Leslie took me out to lunch and worried me over me like a mother hen. I still have the books she gave me. I remember her very fondly. During this time, I began to be the roommate of a poet named Daniel Moore. One year for Daniel's birthday, I made and bound a little book of collages for him. At the same time, I was working for a publisher in Berkeley, running an A.B. Dick offset press, and for fun, I thought I'd print off a small edition of Daniel's birthday book. I didn't know any type, so I just wrote the title page out by hand. I printed 60 copies, and I took them around and tried to sell them for 50 cents in the local bookstores, but no one was interested. When one showed up in a bookstore a few years later, Steve Clay, the bookseller, called me up and said, "What was that?" And I said, "Just buy it, it's my first book." He reminded me of that the other day. At this time, Danny needed a job, and so he went to work in San Francisco for his old friend Andrew Hoyam, who was then in partnership with Robert Grabhorn. One day, when Robert Grabhorn and Andrew were running late on a commission, Daniel asked me if I could spare a few days, so I found myself in the bindery folding and tipping in plates for sketches of California and Hawaii that the Book Club of California was publishing. I'll never forget Jane Grabhorn knitting by the window overlooking Commercial Street, and Bob sitting in a chair in front of a type case, setting type. Every time I sit down in a chair in my print shop to set type, I think very fondly of Bob. By then I had illustrated and was printing the color plates for 2 poems by H.D., and I decided to have the text printed at Grabhorn Hoyam. Glenn Todd, who executed the press work, and Andrew suggested that we use Palatino type, and gave me a taste for the types of Herman Zoff. The next year, when I printed John Kiger's The Saccio Notebook, I had the text set in Zoff's Aldous. I printed this and a book by Lawrence Ferlinghetti on offset press, this being before I was overcome by the desire for the quality that letterpress printing can lead to in fine booklet. I had been satisfied up to that point by printing my lithography. After all, I'd been taught in high school that it was the wave of the future, and I could see the letterpress shops quickly becoming a thing of the past. But when one day Clifford Burke offered me the use of platinum press and cranium press to print the Red Wheelbarrow, I couldn't resist. Clifford, who generously assumed that a certain amount of instruction would have to be given to me, was quite surprised when I quickly locked up 4 pages in the chase, slid a coin key into the corner, and tested for lift. Seeing that none of the type fell out, he queried, "Where did you learn to do that? You're an offset man." Well, not for much longer. On my 25th birthday in 1972, I decided I'd had enough of the dull routine of offset job work, and I wanted to print books and use the finer materials of my craft. After several months, and through the kind offices of a friend, Carl Lancaster, I found myself in a warehouse on 9th Street in Berkeley with a Latin press, a paper cutter, and a few cases of battered cloister type. Through Leslie Clark, I met Roger Levinson of the Tamalpais Press. Roger was very kind to me in the first years I was in letterpress business. He always welcomed me into his shop, and he would lend an ear when I'm asking him questions about what he thought about design or some problem I was having with printing. I think of all the people I've known, Roger taught me the most about printing, and I still like to think of him as my mentor. Roger liked to tell me how he learned to print the same way from the Kennedy brothers and Hayward Hunt when he was starting out. I still think this is the best way to learn craft. By this time, I discovered Daniel Berkeley Updike and his wonderful book, Printing Types. I immersed myself in Updike and found the work of John Henry Nash. I found that they had Nash's paper at Bancroft, and in fact, everything he'd ever printed, including all of his ephemera. So I would spend hours looking at that. It was quite interesting. I also read quite a bit of Stanley Morris in those days, which I found interesting. And it was that interest in Morrison and the history of typographic letter forms that led me to meet and become good friends with the late John Charles Tarr. Tarr, in his early 80s when I knew him, was introduced to me the early 20th century European tastes and styles. British by birth, he had studied calligraphy with Edward Johnson, worked at the monotype drawing office during the making of Times New Roman, and had been a close associate with Morrison and Eric Gill. Later, he taught and wrote about the history of printing. It was Tar who encouraged me to mix typefaces and size, creating a new font to get the typographic effort I wanted. Why not, he asked me. They did so freely in the 15th century. I'm sure many of my typographic interests were formed by following John's leads and reading his books. One of John's interests, and perhaps the one that has given me the strongest influence in me, was lettering and calligraphy. Thus, when I read Cobden Sanderson's Ideal Book of Book Beautiful, I was struck by his remarks. Handwriting and hand decoration of letters and pages are at the root of the book beautiful and are at the root of typography. Indeed, everyone having to do with the making of books should ground himself in the practice or knowledge of the art of beautiful writing or calligraphy. In examining Cobden Sanderson on Doe's press books, I was pleased to see many tasteful use of hand-drawn capitals, words and phrases, and I decided that given the opportunity, I would follow Cobden Sanderson's lead, and calligraphy would become a handmade type in my work whenever it was appropriate. Following that, I was able to work with fine calligraphy artists such as Georgiana Greenwood, Barbara Bash, John Prestonani, Christopher Steinauer, and Susan Skarsgård. A part of every printer's life, of course, is the generation of ephemera. This includes letterheads, brochures, announcements, and business cards. In my case, some of the most interesting work that has come my way has been menus. Over the years, a great deal of these have been created for special occasions. They were printed in large and small quantities, from 900 copies for a month-long restaurant review, or to 2 copies for a birthday. In 1980, the Special Collections Department at San Francisco Public Library mounted a show of these menus. For the occasion, I printed a poster announcement. On it, I reproduced a sample menu. I say reproduced because it's actually new and written to tempt the envy of any good cook. Everything offered on the menu, wine and food alike, was just possible to have, but impossible to find or afford. It led to much speculation. Although broadsides were not a specialty of the press, I had the good fortune for 15 years or so to print 1 or 2 a year for most books in Berkeley to be given out to the customers in New York. From time to time, I printed translations of Chinese, Indian, and African poetry, the Spanish of Pablo Neruda, as well as Bay Area printers like George Oppen, Philip Whalen, Michael McClure, and of course, Robert Duncan. Robert came over in 1972 from San Francisco to hand set and hand color one of his own poems, which he then printed. Done in an edition of only 5 copies, it's one of the rarest of his works. For much of a decade, in the last years, the shop was occupied with the production of journals and books. From 1980, after the Amaranth Press closed its doors, Will Powers approached me with the idea of printing Fine Print magazine and a quarterly newsletter for the book club, together with in a kind of a limited partnership. I readily agreed, and we soon applied for and were appointed the printers to these journals. Although the design of Fine Print changed rarely, Will and I decided to redesign the newsletter with every annual volume. In the past, these had only changed with its printer. Every year, long and happy discussions would take place during summer as we ran off the last copies of the year. Gumbo, one would shout over the roar of the cylinder press. Caslon would come the cranky response. Soon after, we'd laugh and settle on Gaudy Modern. We also, during those years, printed Bankruptiana for the Bancroft Library, as well as the Bohemian Club library notes brought to us by Marianne Hinkle. Although Will and I were partners only in those jobs, we often worked together on other projects. With Will at the composing stone and myself on the press, we could often turn out work with surprising speed. The press work for the 90-page book, A Comprehensive Approach to the Piano, occupied only 4 days. But there was one book project that Tanner and Powers still took a great deal of pride in. This was the collected letters of Frank Norris, printed for the book club in 1986. A large quarto of 240 pages, the press work alone required a month's time. In October of 1987 issue of Fine Print, Will give a fine recounting of the project, and countless choices had to be made during the design project. One of the most interesting parts for me was during some picture research at the Bancroft Library, I found a photograph in the Frank Norris collection of a Mexican restaurant in what appeared to be a Chinese neighborhood. Upon inquiring to the editor, it turned out to be where Norris courted his bride Jeanette in 1897 and figured in his novel Flicks. We used it in the book. In January later that year, Will and his wife Cheryl Miller moved to St. Paul in Minnesota and thus ended up temporarily our partnership. Years later, when I started to design books in Ann Arbor, I spent a number of years working with Will while he was the design manager at the Minnesota Center for Historical Society Press. And I must say that over the years, many fine people have worked with me at the press. Alistair Johnson, Bromley Waite, who went on to have a print shop in England and France, Jerry Redden, were early on, to be followed later on by Terry Horgan, Linnea Lundquist, and Virginia Mudd. Fiona Thompson worked at the press as a shop's binder, as well as Shelley Hoyt. In addition to those working in the press, I've been pleased to work with many gifted artists. This charming book, La Ceinture, has binding papers designed by the Berkeley Artist and Book Club member, Lisa Bruce. The title page has an etching by Joseph Goldine, one of several projects we did together. As I mentioned, my studies in calligraphy and the history of type design led me in a new direction. When Sumner Stone was just beginning the process of type design development of Adobe systems, he gave a talk in 1987, premiering his design, Sewn Sans. After the talk, I asked him if Adobe was planning to produce any type ornaments. That's interesting, he said. Come down to Palo Alto and talk to us about it. When I arrived the next week, I found Carol Twomley working on her rendering of the Caslon typeface. Happily, I could loan her my copy of Caslon's 1734 broadsheet. I was able to advise her on the swash letters that were added in the 19th century and pointed out the additional original type ornaments at the bottom of the broadsheet. Soon I was provided with a Mac Plus, the first laser printer, and a beta copy of Illustrator from Adobe software. The 18 ornaments I drew are still part of the Adobe Caslon package. Later, in 1990, I was invited to a type design conference in Oxford to deliver a lecture on the history of type design ornaments. Armed with my new skills in computer drawing, I've since drawn title page lettering for all the books I've printed in the subsequent years in Michigan and here in Western Massachusetts. In the mid-90s, I discovered that the School of Art and Design had a laser cutter available to me, and I used it to cut plywood for woodcut printing. I printed 2 books with color illustrations with this new technique. Ultima Thule by Nicholas Christopher has over 120 cuts. A copy may be seen in the book club library. I encourage you to see that. I think I'm very proud of it myself. The title page has some of the lettering that I was telling you about. It goes with the woodcut. This is lettering, and the type ornaments were done by computer as well. Illustrator has been a good friend to me over the years. This book, which had drawings and etchings by Sean McElroy, also had lettering by me that was drawn on the computer. It's the Hymn to Dionysius. Sean translated the book and did the etchings. Here's another little piece of lettering I did recently for the complete poems of the poet Rufinus. Finally, I would just like to thank the book club and its members for this wonderful opportunity to speak to you and accept my Oscar Lewis Award. And I wish you good night from the woods of Western Massachusetts.
we will be sending you this certificate. We thank you so very, very much for allowing us to learn so much about you that we never would have known if we were not sitting here this evening with great, great attention to your wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Norm, he outdid himself.
You
I thought I
outdid
knew
yourself.
something about Wesley, but he was remarkable. And I'm the man that nominated him, so.
That's
he did
true.
a great job.
Thank you. And now for Sharon.
Thank you, Norman. This year's Oscar Lewis Award for Western History was awarded to Charles Fracchia. Charles Fracchio was a historian and longtime member of the Book Club of California, having served as vice president and as a member of several committees. Unfortunately, he passed away in July 2021. But before he passed away, he was notified of his award, and I was actually honored to be able to discuss this award with him when he called. I did not tell him of the award, but I was able to congratulate him, and I think he was very honored to have it awarded to him. As an author and an educator, he chronicled the arc of San Francisco history from the gold rush to the present. Along the way, he managed both to create and preserve history, including writing 5 scholarly books on the history of California and San Francisco, co-founding Rolling Stone magazine, and founding the San Francisco Historical Society in 1988. He was instrumental in preserving the history of the West by serving as one of the earliest advocates for the transfer of the historic Old Mint from federal ownership to the city and county of San Francisco. 2 of his books, Fire and Gold and When the Water Came Up to Montgomery Street, deserve special notice as well. Researched and engaging works on San Francisco, making significant contributions to the history of the West. In all, Charles Fracchia authored 15 published books, and most recently, The Palimpsest, A Man's Life in San Francisco. He spoke about this work at the book club in April of 2019. Charles Fracchia has made several contributions to the Book Club of California's quarterly newsletter over the years, and has had several articles published in the California Historical Society's Quarterly, the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Christian Science Monitor, and other journals and periodicals. In addition to his published books, he has written articles and book reviews, too numerous to mention. Fracchia spent the first 25 years of his career in investment banking, and then more than 30 years as an academic. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from the University of San Francisco, and then 3 master's degrees. 1 in history from San Francisco State, 1 in library science from UC Berkeley, and 1 in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. He had been a featured speaker at the Commonwealth Club of California, and he was a long-standing member of the Roxburgh Club of San Francisco, and as I mentioned before, an active and influential member of the Book Club of California. Please join me in recognizing Charles Fracchia, recipient of the 2021 Oscar Lewis Award for Western History. His family is here with us this evening, and I would like to invite them to the podium to say a few words.
It'll be a miracle if I can do this without crying, but good evening. Sorry. My earliest memories of my father involve books and history. When I was struggling to learn how to read, my father decided that I would read with him. So sorry. Thank you. That I would read with him every day before I could go out and play. The book he chose was Lost Worlds by Anne Terry White. Its subtitle is Adventures in Archaeology, and so a love of both reading and history was born. You'd think that a book written in 1941 and forced on a 6-year-old might have had the opposite effect, but it didn't. When I finished, he gave me God's Graves and Scholars, another archaeological tome. I didn't mind because my love of all things ancient had been sparked. Once I finished those, I could choose freely and remember bringing home stacks of books from the library. My father and I shared a love of books of all kinds and a love of history. We roamed not only the streets of San Francisco, but the streets of Paris, New York, and London together. He knew so much about the history and architecture of all those cities that a wander with him was truly an adventure. Everything was made alive and interesting.
Ma'am, take a seat.
I'm okay, thank you. My father would be so proud to accept this award. I thank you on his behalf and on behalf of my stepmother, my uncle, and myself. Thank you. And my father said something too.
Oh, okay, sorry. On part 2. Hi, I'm Liz Fracchia. I'm Charles' wife. Thank you for coming this evening. You're going to get me crying too more. Anyhow, I was there when Charles got the phone call that he received the award. And I can assure you he was so ecstatic. And he said to me that he felt like he waited his whole life for this award. And we opened a bottle of champagne, and he talked about Oscar Lewis, and he talked about the days when Kevin Starr and Al Shoemate and he would all go off to historical events together. So this award meant a lot to him, I think also because he knew Oscar Lewis. Charles was a man of passions, many passions. One of his passions was family and friends. His friends benefited from his being a tremendous mentor to them. There was never anybody who called that wanted to come see him that he said no. He was passionate about travel. We traveled throughout the world together, and I used to say, who needs the blue guide? I have Charles. You know, he knew about everything. Teaching, he was a tremendous teacher. One of the things I loved about his teaching is that he never diminished a student. And he loved clubs. He, was just, the last club he joined was the Lotus Club, which meant so much to him with the writers and artists club in New York City. And he was passionate about his faith. He was passionate about maps, much more than I ever realized in his lifetime. I've got a job ahead of me. He was passionate about maps and naps. But most of all, he was passionate about history and books. And I have 2 little stories to tell you about Charles with his books particularly. He collected books and he grew attached to books. And as I was going through the house, I found 2 books from USF Library. So I thought I'll return them. So I'm in the book drop, putting them in, and I thought, I wonder what the due date is. It was 2016. And so it was The Diary of Samuel Pepys. And the other story I have is that Charles one morning woke up and he was completely distressed, like visibly upset. And I said, what happened, Charles? What? And he said, I had the most horrible nightmare last night. And I said, well, what was it? And he said, I dreamt every single book that I ordered came without their dust jackets. I can't make this up. I had no choice but to comfort him. So, thank you for this honor. It made such a great deal to him. And I personally think you chose very, very well. And I'm sorry Charles isn't here, but he is in some ways. Thank you.
I'd like to present you with the certificate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, it's my honor. Thank you.
It's our honor, and it was really overdue. very surprised that we had not recognized him before this. So this concludes the presentation of the Oscar Lewis Awards for both 2020 and 2021. Thank all of you for joining us in person, and all of you out in YouTube Streamland for joining us as well. I'm delighted that we are able to gather in person again on just a limited basis, and I look forward to the next time we meet at the book club or in an online community. Thank you all again for joining us and for your continued support of the Book Club of California.